Father Gabriel stirred awake in the small hours, his room cloaked in the kind of darkness that pressed in on all sides. He lay still, his heart beating in the oppressive silence, listening for that sound that had haunted him as a child, the distant murmur of whispers, the shadowy figures that would crawl across his bedroom walls. But there was nothing now, only the quiet murmur of the wind outside his window and the creaking of the old rectory. He sat up, running a hand through his graying hair. These dreams were returning after all these years, and he wasn't sure why. Hollow Creek had always been a place that kept its secrets well. It was a town shrouded in fog, surrounded by a dense forest that seemed to swallow both sound and light. Its residents were a superstitious lot, quick to whisper about curses and spirits. Father Gabriel had spent years dismissing their fears, reassuring them that the evils they spoke of were nothing more than tales, born out of the isolation and darkness that enveloped their lives. But now, as he looked out the window into the impenetrable blackness of the night, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching. He got up and dressed, the old wooden floor creaking beneath his feet. The sensation of being observed didn't leave him as he made his way down to the kitchen, lighting a candle to ward off the shadows that seemed to cling to the corners of every room. "You're losing it, Gabriel," he muttered to himself as he poured a glass of water. He hadn't thought of those childhood nightmares in years, not since his mother died. The circumstances of her death had been a mystery. Found in her bed, eyes wide open, her face twisted in an expression of sheer terror. The doctors had ruled it a heart attack, but Gabriel had seen the marks on her wrists, the deep bruises as if something had held her down. He'd been 10 years old then, alone in a house that seemed suddenly vast and hostile. He pushed the memories aside. It did no good to dwell on the past, especially now when the present was troubling enough. In recent weeks, Hollow Creek had been plagued by a string of unsettling events. Livestock found with their throats torn out, children waking in the night screaming of dark figures at the foot of their beds, and then the fog, a dense, suffocating mist that rolled in from the woods and refused to leave. It wasn't natural, even by Hollow Creek's standards. As the first light of dawn began to creep through the trees, Gabriel heard a soft knock at the door. He set down his glass and walked to the front entrance, half expecting to find the steps empty. But there stood Elizabeth, her face pale and eyes wide with fear. "Father," she breathed, her voice trembling. "It's Michael. There's something wrong with him." Gabriel had known Elizabeth for years. She was not one to scare easily. Her younger brother, Michael, was a quiet child, often seen trailing behind her like a shadow. But now she spoke of him as if he were a stranger. "Come in," Gabriel said, ushering her inside. She clutched her coat around her like a shield, her hands trembling as she sat down. For a moment they sat in silence, the air between them heavy with unspoken dread. "It started a few weeks ago," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "He started having nightmares, terrible ones. He'd wake up screaming, thrashing around like he was fighting something. I thought it was just stress, maybe. But then he began saying things." Gabriel leaned forward. "What kind of things?" "He knows things he shouldn't, Father. Things about people in the town, about me, about you." She paused, her eyes searching his face for any sign of disbelief. "Last night, he spoke in a voice that wasn't his. It was deep, guttural. He said things that terrified me." Gabriel felt a chill run down his spine. He wanted to tell her it was all in her head, that Michael was just a child going through some psychological trauma. But he couldn't ignore the fear in her eyes, the same fear he'd seen in his mother's eyes so long ago. "Where is he now?" Gabriel asked, his voice steady despite the turmoil within him. "At home. I've locked him in his room," she admitted, her face flushed with shame. "I didn't know what else to do. He started to change, Father. His body twisted. like something was inside him, trying to get out. Gabriel stood up, his mind racing. This was more than a case of night terrors. He'd heard of possession, of course, but he'd always been skeptical. Yet something about this, about the way Elizabeth described it, felt too real, too familiar. "Take me to him," he said, his voice firm. "Now." They left the rectory in haste, the early morning fog wrapping around them like a shroud as they walked through the deserted streets. The town seemed to hold its breath, the usual sounds of dawn, birds chirping, the rustle of leaves, eerily absent. Gabriel felt a weight in the air, a pressure that grew heavier. Father Gabriel and Elizabeth approached the farmhouse, an oppressive silence hanging over the place like a heavy shroud. The sky above Hollow Creek was cloaked in a thick blanket of gray, the sun struggling to pierce through the dense fog that seemed to cling to the house. It was as if the very air around the property had become infected, weighed down by a darkness that was palpable, almost suffocating. The door creaked open as they entered, the stench of raw and decay hitting them with an almost physical force. The house was eerily quiet, save for the occasional rustle of something moving in the shadows. Gabriel felt the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. He had been in many houses, had comforted many families, but this was different. The house itself felt alive, as though it was a living entity, watching them, waiting for them to make a mistake. Elizabeth led him down the narrow hallway to Michael's room. The door was closed, locked from the outside. Gabriel hesitated, feeling the weight of what lay beyond that door pressing down on him. He glanced at Elizabeth, her face pale and drawn, eyes wide with fear. She nodded slightly, her lips trembling as she whispered, He's been like this for days." Gabriel took a deep breath and unlocked the door. The room was dark, the windows covered with heavy drapes that let in no light. The smell inside was worse than before, a rancid odor of sweat, blood, and something else, something that made his stomach twist. He forced himself to step inside, his eyes adjusting to the dim light. Michael was there, crouched in the far corner of the room. His body was contorted, twisted in a way that no human body should be able to twist. His arms and legs bent at odd angles, his spine arched in a grotesque curve. His head hung low, his face obscured by a curtain of matted hair. He was muttering something under his breath, a language Gabriel couldn't recognize, guttural, ancient, like the sound of rocks grinding against each other. "Michael," Gabriel called softly, his voice betraying a hint of the fear he felt. The boy's head snapped up with such speed that Gabriel took a step back. Michael's eyes, once brown and full of life, were now black, hollow pits that reflected nothing but darkness. His lips pulled back into a wide, unnatural grin, revealing teeth that were sharper than they should have been, like a predator's. "Father Gabriel," the voice that came from the boy was not his own. It was deep, resonant, a voice that carried with it the weight of centuries. It spoke his name with a familiarity that sent a chill racing down his spine. "You've come to play." Gabriel swallowed, his mouth dry. He reached for the crucifix around his neck, clutching it tightly as he took a step closer. "You are not Michael," he said firmly. "You are something else, something that does not belong here." The thing inside Michael laughed, a sound that was more a low rumble than anything human. The room seemed to vibrate with it, the air growing colder. Gabriel watched as Michael's body twisted even further, bones cracking, joints popping. It was as though the thing inside him was trying to reshape his body, bending it to its will. "Belong," the voice mocked. "I have always belonged. I was here long before you, and I will be here long after. This body is mine now, as was your mother's." Did she scream, Father? Did she beg? Gabriel felt the blood drain from his face. How did it know? How could it possibly know about his mother? He took another step forward, raising the crucifix. "I command you to leave this boy," he said, his voice steady but laced with an undercurrent of desperation. "In the name of God, release him." The entity's smile widened, and it began to convulse violently, its body slamming against the walls and floor with a sickening thud. Shadows danced across the room, swirling and writhing as if alive. Gabriel watched in horror as the symbols began to etch themselves into the walls, arcane symbols, twisted and grotesque, glowing faintly with a sickly greenish light. The air grew thicker, heavy with a malevolence that made it hard to breathe. Objects in the room began to move on their own. The bed rattled, the lamp on the bedside table shattered, shards of glass flying across the room. Gabriel ducked as a piece narrowly missed his face, embedding itself into the wooden door behind him. Elizabeth stood in the doorway, paralyzed with fear. "Father," she whispered, her voice trembling. "What's happening to him?" Gabriel couldn't answer. His mind was racing, trying to find some rational explanation, but there was none. This was beyond anything he had ever encountered, beyond the limits of what he believed possible. He had come here to confront a troubled child, but instead he was facing something ancient, something that had been waiting in the dark recesses of the world for a moment like this. Michael's body went limp suddenly, collapsing onto the floor like a rag doll. For a brief moment, there was silence. Gabriel cautiously approached, kneeling beside the boy. Michael's eyes were closed, his breathing shallow. He looked almost peaceful, as if he were merely asleep. Gabriel reached out a hand, hesitating before placing it gently on the boy's shoulder. "Michael," he called softly. There was no response. And then, with a swiftness that made Gabriel jerk back, Michael's eyes snapped open, now glowing a fiery red. He lunged forward, hands clawing at Gabriel's face. Gabriel fell backward, his back slamming into the wall. He felt the boy's fingers wrap around his throat, an unnatural strength squeezing the life out of him. He gasped for air, his vision blurring at the edges. "She called for you, you know," the voice hissed, its tone venomous and filled with glee. "She called for her precious Gabriel as she died. But you were too late. You were always too late." Gabriel felt a surge of anger and fear. He reached for the crucifix again, pressing it against Michael's chest. The boy screamed, a high-pitched wail that echoed through the room, piercing Gabriel's ears. The force of it pushed Gabriel back, releasing him from the boy's grip. Michael crumpled to the floor, writhing in agony as smoke rose from where the crucifix had touched him. Gabriel staggered to his feet, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. Elizabeth rushed to his side, her face pale and eyes wide with terror. "What do we do?" she cried, tears streaming down her face. "What do we do, Father?" Gabriel looked at the boy on the floor, at the room around them now twisted and marked by the malevolent force that had taken hold of it. There was no doubt now. This was possession, true possession. Not the kind seen in films or read about in books, but something real, something that crawled into the very fabric of their reality and tore it apart from the inside. "We have to perform an exorcism," he said, his voice grim. "And we have to do it soon, before it's too late." As he spoke, the room darkened, the shadows creeping closer as if responding to his words. Gabriel knew the path ahead would be fraught with danger, that the battle they were about to face would test the limits of his faith and his sanity. But there was no turning back now. The possession had begun, and the entity that lurked within Michael would not release its hold without a fight. Gabriel steeled himself, knowing that the haunting of Hollow Creek was not just a tale whispered in fear, but a reality they would have to confront. And it was only going to get worse from here. The storm raged outside the farmhouse, as if nature itself was revolting against what was about to take place within its walls. Father Gabriel stood in the dimly lit room, his hands shaking as he thumbed through the worn pages of the exorcism rite. Beside him, Sister Agnes knelt, her face hidden in the shadows, whispering prayers under her breath. She had been summoned from the nearby convent, known for her experience in confronting the darkest corners of the spiritual world. Yet even she appeared uneasy, her eyes darting to Michael's contorted form strapped to the bed. The candles flickered, their flames dancing wildly in the cold, stale air. Michael lay still, his body strapped down with heavy leather restraints. His eyes were closed, his skin deathly pale, lips cracked and dry. Gabriel watched as his chest rose and fell with shallow breaths. It was the calm before the storm, the silence that heralded something far worse. Gabriel turned to Sister Agnes. Her hands gripped a rosary so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. "Are you ready?" he asked, his voice barely audible over the howling wind outside. She nodded, but her expression revealed the fear she tried to suppress. "As ready as we can be," she replied, "but this feels different, more powerful than anything I've ever faced." Gabriel couldn't disagree. This was unlike any exorcism he had read about or imagined. The entity within Michael was old, ancient, something that had been lying in wait, biding its time in the shadows. It was not just a demon, it was something that thrived on the despair and fear that it fed upon for centuries. He approached the bed, holding the crucifix in one hand and the prayer book in the other. He began to recite the rite, his voice trembling at first but growing stronger with each word. "In the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, who lives and reigns with the Father and the Holy Spirit, I command you, unclean spirit, to reveal yourself." At first, nothing happened. Michael lay motionless, the room eerily still except for the crackling of the candle flames. Gabriel continued, his voice a steady rhythm against the silence. Sister Agnes joined him, her voice a whispered echo of the prayers. The room began to grow colder, the temperature dropping so rapidly that their breath fogged the air. Suddenly, Michael's eyes snapped open, and a guttural growl emanated from deep within him. His body convulsed, the restraints straining against his violent movements. His mouth opened and a voice, not his own, spoke, echoing off the walls with a resonance that made Gabriel's bones ache. "Fools," the voice hissed, low and malevolent. "You think you can banish me? I am older than your God, older than this world. You are nothing." Gabriel felt a shiver of fear, but forced himself to continue. "In the name of the Holy Spirit, I command you to leave this child," he said, holding the crucifix higher, directing its power toward the malevolent force. Michael's body contorted violently, his limbs twisting in ways that defied nature. His head turned, eyes locking onto Gabriel with a hatred that burned like fire. "You," the entity spat, its voice dripping with malice. "You cannot drive me out. I was here before you, and I will be here long after you are dust." Gabriel recoiled as Michael's face began to change, shifting and morphing until it no longer resembled the boy they knew. It twisted into the faces of those Gabriel had lost, his mother, eyes wide and lifeless, lips parting to release a silent scream. Gabriel's heart pounded in his chest, the room around him blurring as memories flooded his mind. He saw himself as a child, standing over his mother's lifeless body, her eyes boring into him with a final, unanswered question. He staggered back, gasping for breath. Sister Agnes grabbed his arm, pulling him back to reality. "Father, focus," she urged, her voice a lifeline in the darkness. "Do not let it get inside your head." Gabriel nodded, trying to steady himself. The entity was trying to break him, to shatter his resolve by using his deepest fears against him. He could not allow it to succeed. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and resumed the prayer, forcing each word out as though it were a weapon against the darkness. As they chanted, the room erupted into chaos. The candles flickered and died, plunging them into darkness. The walls vibrated, plaster cracking and falling to the floor in chunks. Shadows moved across the room, writhing and twisting, forming grotesque shapes that clawed at the edges of the candlelight. The temperature plummeted, and an unearthly wail filled the air, a sound so filled with anguish and rage that it made Gabriel's heart falter. The bed shook violently, slamming against the floor. Michael screamed, a high-pitched, inhuman wail that resonated through Gabriel's very soul. The boy's body arched off the bed, straining against the restraints. His skin began to change color, mottling into shades of gray and black, as if the darkness within was seeping out to consume him. Gabriel and Sister Agnes continued their prayers, voices rising to a fever pitch as they struggled to keep control. "By the blood of Christ, we command you," they shouted, forcing the words out against the onslaught of evil that pushed back against them. The shadows in the room gathered, swirling into a vortex above Michael's body. The boy's eyes rolled back into his head, his mouth opening impossibly wide, a gaping maw of darkness. Gabriel felt the force of the entity's power pushing against him, a wall of malevolence that threatened to crush his very spirit. The entity laughed, a deep, guttural sound that made Gabriel's skin crawl. "You are nothing," it sneered. "I have waited centuries for this. You cannot win." Gabriel hesitated, the weight of those words crushing down on him. The entity began to project images into his mind, visions of his own failures, of every soul he had been unable to save, of his mother reaching out to him, her face twisted in agony. He felt his resolve weakening, the darkness creeping into his heart. "No," he whispered, clutching the crucifix with all his strength. "You will not take him. You will not take me." He stepped forward, pressing the crucifix against Michael's forehead. The boy let out a shriek that shook the very foundations of the house. The shadows recoiled, the vortex above them dissipating with a howl of fury. Michael's body convulsed, and a cloud of black smoke erupted from his mouth, swirling violently before dispersing into the air with a final, anguished scream. The room fell silent. The candles flickered back to life, casting a dim, wavering light across the scene. Michael lay motionless on the bed, his chest heaving with shallow breaths. His skin was ashen, sweat pouring down his face, but the darkness in his eyes was gone. Gabriel staggered back, feeling a cold sweat trickle down his spine. He had done it. They had driven the entity out. He turned to Sister Agnes, who knelt beside the bed, checking Michael's pulse. She looked up at him, her expression a mix of relief and exhaustion. "It's over," she whispered, her voice shaking. "For now, at least." Gabriel nodded, but as he looked at the boy lying there, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The room felt empty, not in the sense that it was now devoid of evil, but as if it had been hollowed out, a shell left behind after the true terror had departed. He watched as Michael slowly opened his eyes, blinking against the light. The boy looked at him, his eyes no longer black but a dull, lifeless gray. "Father Gabriel," he whispered, his voice weak, "it's still here." Gabriel froze, his heart skipping a beat. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Michael's gaze drifted past him, staring at something in the shadows. "It's not gone," he murmured. "It's inside you now." Gabriel felt a cold hand clutch his heart. He turned slowly, looking into the shadows that seemed to move on their own, shifting and writhing as if alive. For a moment he saw it, a dark figure, tall and looming, its eyes burning with a malevolent fire. It stared at him, unblinking, a twisted smile forming on its face. "No," Gabriel whispered, stepping back. The shadows crept closer, wrapping around him like a suffocating fog. He felt the air grow cold, the familiar sense of dread seeping into his bones. The entity had not been expelled. It had simply shifted its focus, its attention now fully fixed on him. "Father Gabriel," the voice whispered from the darkness, a cold breath against his ear. "This was never about the boy. It was always about you." Gabriel stumbled back, clutching the crucifix to his chest as the shadows closed in around him. He had not banished the evil. He had only invited it deeper into his own soul. And as the darkness consumed him, he realized with dawning horror that the exorcism had been a trap, a twisted game that the entity had played to gain what it truly desired: him. The storm outside intensified, the wind howling as the house shook. Gabriel fell to his knees, the shadows enveloping him in their cold embrace. And in the darkness he heard it laughing, a deep, guttural laugh that echoed through the corridors of his mind, a sound that would haunt him for the rest of his days. The possession was over, but the nightmare had only just begun. Father Gabriel sat in the rectory, staring at the flickering candle on his desk. The flame wavered as if caught in an unseen wind, casting long, distorted shadows on the walls. It had been weeks since the exorcism, but Hollow Creek had not returned to normal. If anything, the town had grown quieter, the air heavier with an unspoken tension. People avoided each other's eyes, and the streets were empty long before sundown. Gabriel knew they were all waiting for something they couldn't name, for a horror they couldn't see, but felt creeping in the dark corners of their lives. Michael had been recovering, or so it seemed. The boy was distant, his once bright eyes now dull, as though a piece of his soul had been ripped away and left behind in that farmhouse. Gabriel visited him often, sitting by his bedside searching for some sign that the child was still in there. But Michael would only stare back at him with those hollow eyes, his lips occasionally parting as if to speak, then closing again in silence. The nightmares had returned for Gabriel. Night after night, he found himself standing in his childhood home, the shadows around him whispering his name. He would see his mother lying in her bed, her eyes wide and mouth twisted in a scream that never came. Then the darkness would swallow her, reaching out to him, pulling him into the abyss. He would wake drenched in sweat, the feeling of being watched lingering long after the dream had faded. But it wasn't just the dreams. During the day, he would catch glimpses of movement in the corner of his eye, shadows that darted out of sight the moment he turned to look. He heard faint whispers when he was alone, words he couldn't quite make out, but that filled him with a growing sense of dread. The rectory had become a prison, each creak and groan of the old building a reminder that something had followed him back from that farmhouse. One evening, he decided he could no longer ignore the truth gnawing at the edges of his sanity. He had to understand what had happened during the exorcism, what had been released into the world, and into him. He found himself drawn to the old chest in his office, the one that held relics of his past, of his family. He opened it with trembling hands, rifling through the musty papers and worn books until his fingers closed around a small leather-bound journal. It was his mother's. He hesitated for a moment, then opened it, the pages brittle under his touch. Her handwriting was neat, precise, but as he read, it grew more frantic, the letters slanting and the ink smudging, as though she had written these entries in a feverish panic. What he found within those pages made his blood run cold. August 14th. The dreams are getting worse. The shadow is always there, watching me. I can feel it in the house, in the very walls. It speaks to me, whispers things I don't understand. Gabriel sees it too. I know he does, even if he won't say it. The entity, it wants him. September 2nd. I made the pact. I had to. It was the only way to protect him. It promised to leave him alone if I let it in. God, forgive me. I don't know if it will keep its word, but I had no choice. I had to save my son. September 20th. It lied. It never intended to leave him. It just wanted a way in. It used me, and now it's free. Gabriel, he must never know. He must never know what I did, what I unleashed. It's inside the walls. It's inside him. Gabriel's breath hitched as he read the last entry. His mother had made a pact with the entity, believing it would save him. But instead, it had used her, biding its time until it could sink its claws into him. A sickening realization washed over him. This was never about Michael. The boy had been a pawn, a means to an end. The entity had marked Gabriel from the beginning, had haunted his family for generations, and now it had what it wanted. He dropped the journal, its pages fluttering shut as it hit the floor. He staggered back, the room spinning around him. The whispers grew louder, swirling in his ears, words and phrases that made his skin crawl. He stumbled toward the mirror on the wall, staring at his reflection. His face was pale, his eyes sunken and hollow. But there was something else. For a fleeting moment he saw it, the shadow standing behind him, its eyes gleaming with a malevolent joy. "No," he whispered, shaking his head. "This can't be." The shadow moved closer, its form shifting and pulsating like a dark mist. He felt its cold breath on the back of his neck, a shiver that ran down his spine. He closed his eyes, gripping the edge of the sink, willing it to be a hallucination, a trick of his mind. But the voice that spoke next was unmistakably real. "It was always you, Gabriel," it hissed, the words sliding into his ears like poison. "I have been with you since the beginning. You thought you could banish me, but I have never truly left. You belong to me." Gabriel opened his eyes, staring into the mirror, but it was no longer his reflection that stared back. It was the face of the entity, twisted, dark, with eyes that burned with an ancient fire. He stumbled back, the room around him warping and distorting. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows stretching out their limbs, reaching for him. He felt his own mind being pulled apart, pieces of himself being swallowed by the darkness. He ran, crashing through the door of the rectory and out into the cold night air. The fog was thick, swirling around him as he stumbled into the street. Hollow Creek lay silent, its buildings looming like specters in the mist. He heard the whispers all around him now, not just in his head, but in the very air, voices chanting, laughing, calling his name. He fell to his knees, clutching his head, trying to drown out the cacophony that threatened to tear him apart. "Leave me!" he screamed, his voice echoing into the emptiness. "I am not yours!" But the laughter only grew louder, the shadows closing in around him. And then, out of the fog, he saw them. Figures emerging, their faces familiar yet twisted into grotesque masks of horror. The townspeople, all of them with eyes black as pitch, staring at him with expressions of knowing. Elizabeth stood at the forefront, her face a mask of sorrow. "You brought it here," she said, her voice hollow. "You set it free." Gabriel shook his head, tears streaming down his face. No, I tried to save you. I tried to save him." She stepped forward, her eyes boring into his. "It was never about saving us. It was always about you. The entity fed on your doubt, your fear. It was always inside you." The fog thickened, swallowing the figures as they began to chant in unison, their voices merging into a single droning hum that resonated deep within his soul. Gabriel felt the ground give way beneath him, felt himself falling into the void. The shadows wrapped around him, cold and suffocating, pulling him down into the darkness where the entity waited. In his final moments of consciousness, he heard it whispering in his ear, soft and intimate, like a lover's murmur. "This was your first exorcism, Gabriel," it said, "and it will not be your last. You and I, we are one now, forever." The darkness closed in completely, and Gabriel felt himself dissolve into it, his thoughts, his memories, his very essence consumed by the entity that had been his shadow all along. And in the silent, fog-covered streets of Hollow Creek, the whispers continued, carried on the wind. The town remained still as it had always been, a place where the shadows were never just shadows, and the darkness was always watching, waiting for the next soul to fall into its embrace. The candle in the rectory flickered one last time before extinguishing, leaving the room in utter blackness. The book on the floor, the journal of his mother, lay open to a page that now bore new writing, dark, ominous words scrawled in an unsteady hand. "The first exorcism is never the end. It is only the beginning."